Hi, my name's Nick, and in this video, I'm going to give you 7 tips for if you have someone who's locked up or trapped in a psychiatric or mental health hospital. Before we get into our tips, I want to let everyone know a few things. Number one, if you're interested in having me consult for someone who is trapped in a psychiatric hospital, I have an email that I have in the description. You can shoot me an email, or if you'd like me to consult with your attorney or to just advocate on behalf of someone you know who's locked in a psychiatric facility, shoot me an email and we can discuss things from there. Also, this is not legal advice. So this is just like advice. If you came up to me and you're like, Nick, I know you're a behavioral health nurse. My buddy Tom over here is unfortunately locked in a psychiatric institution. Like, what can we do to help him, to support him, to get him out? These are the tips that I would give you. And there's no guarantee. Like, it's super difficult to get anyone out of a psychiatric hospital, but I want to share with you just some information that I think could help you. I also want to give you a little bit of a background as to how these mental health hospitals work, because a lot of people have no idea. I had no idea. I mean, it's crazy. Like, most of our population has no idea how they work. Most people don't know that a mental health hospital could lock you or I up against our will, even if we haven't committed any sort of crime or we haven't violated the rights of any other person. But if we had a mental illness and we were gravely disabled, meaning we couldn't take care of our own basic everyday needs, or we were a danger to others, maybe we wanted to fight or hurt other people, or we were a danger to ourselves, we were cutting our arms or were suicidal, then we could be locked up in a psychiatric facility. So you have to have a mental illness. You have to be either gravely disabled, a danger to yourself, or a danger to others. And you have to fit one of those 3 criteria because of your mental illness. Then you could be locked up against your will. So who's qualified to lock you up? Generally, it's going to be a psychiatrist. If it's not a psychiatrist, it might be a nurse practitioner or a psychologist or any sort of, it could be an RN too, a registered nurse if they have the qualified training. But it's going to be a medical professional who is certified to put you on some sort of hold inside of a hospital. So let's say that we have a mental illness, or it appears we have a mental illness, and we are cutting our arms and saying that we want to kill ourselves. What'll happen often is an ambulance or police will pick us up. They'll bring us to one of these mental hospitals. And then from there, we're put on a 72-hour hold. During the 72-hour hold, what happens is mental health professionals observe us and they see if we meet the criteria. Psychiatrists will assess us and she will be like, okay, I think this person has a mental illness and yeah, they're a danger to themselves. So I'm going to put them on what's known as a short-term certification. There are short-term certifications and there's long-term certifications. A short-term certification is up to 3 months. A long-term certification is up to 6 months. And either one of those certifications can be renewed indefinitely. Seriously, indefinitely. And the good news is that rarely are they extended indefinitely. They have to be renewed either every 3 or every 6 months. A psychiatrist has to go in front of a judge and they have to renew the certification. So if we're put on the 72-hour hold, and then the psychiatrist is like, yeah, I think this guy has a mental illness and I think he is, say, a danger to himself, then the psychiatrist has to petition a judge who will then affirm or disagree with the psychiatrist's findings. And just to let you know, probably like 95+%, the court is going to agree with the findings of the psychiatrist. Then the psychiatrist is most likely going to give the court a list of medication that he or she would like to use for our patient. And then that psychiatrist will pick from that list of medication as to which medication the psychiatrist would like to use to help stabilize the patient. When this happens, we're put on what are known as involuntary medications. So I should also let you know that when you're trapped in one of these mental hospitals, there's what's known as involuntary medication, which is medication given to us against our will. You might not think it's a huge deal, but it kind of is, because the medication is known as psychotropic medication. It changes the way our brain functions. It changes who we are as people, and it really blunts our entire experience of the world. So this is very powerful medication. So there's involuntary medication and there are e-meds, also known as emergency medication. E-meds can be used for up to 10 days. And then at the 10th day, at least here in Colorado, but this is probably somewhat universal throughout the states, after a certain amount of days, the psychiatrist has to petition the courts to continue using those medications. Of course, if they don't petition them in time, they can restart e-meds. So that's kind of a weird loophole. But if the psychiatrist believes that this patient will need medication beyond the e-med period, which is up to 10 days, then they have to petition the court. And then once the court says, okay, yes, you can put this person on these involuntary meds, then you're on what's known as court-ordered or involuntary medication. All right, so that's a little bit of the background. And I will say this, I know it seems a little barbaric to lock someone up against their will if they haven't committed a crime. At the the same time, I think so long as it's not abused, this is a really good law, and it actually does save a lot of people and a lot of lives. And I know some people out there, myself included, probably if I were to watch this video before I had the experience that I have working in mental health, I'd be like, bro, if someone hasn't violated the rights of others, then why are we locking them up? But the reality is there are so many people who are or who become so acutely psychotic that if we don't do anything, the liability there is just way too huge. And I think the same goes for the involuntary and e-meds. I think, although, and I'm someone who's, I don't want to say anti-medication, but I do believe that we use, and by we I mean those of us who work in the mental health professionals, I think we rely on medication way too much, but at the same time, I'm really glad we have it. I'm really glad we have it. Okay, so let's get into our tips. Tip number 1, lawyer up. You need to hire an attorney. You need to hire someone who is experienced with the laws and regulations surrounding mental health in your state. And when you're searching for this lawyer, you want to ask them what experience do they have advocating for patients who are trapped against their will in a mental health hospital. You want to make sure they have a lot of experience and are familiar with all the laws and regulations. So that's number 1. This one's super important. Unfortunately, I know a lot of people out there probably don't have the money to hire an attorney. Like I probably wouldn't either. So that kind of sucks. But there might be some people out there who are willing to work on like a pro bono basis, or there's probably some advocacy groups you can find out there who might be willing to work for free. And by the way, if you want me to advocate for a patient on your behalf or for one of your loved ones who's trapped in a psychiatric facility, if you want me to consult with your lawyer or with the institution who is locking up your loved one, please shoot me an email below. We can talk about consultation prices and all of that. My email's in the link below. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe this video if you already haven't. All right, the second piece of advice I would give you is to get your loved one to sign what's known as an ROI, which is a release of information. This is so crucial. If you have this, it means the world. What you really want is you want unrestricted access to their medical and psychiatric files. So any notes that are written about your loved one while they're inside the hospital, you want access to those notes. You want access to their treatment plan, which pretty much are the goals and objectives of what the treatment team has for your loved one while they're there. You want access to that. You want to know what sort of assessments are being done, what kind of groups they're attending, what kind of medication they're on. You want to know every possible thing. The only way you're going to get that is to have your loved one sign that ROI. The only thing that's kind of difficult about this is a lot of patients, even though they might have a supportive network outside of the hospital, sometimes they are either embarrassed or they're humiliated or they just don't feel comfortable or they're so psychotic that they don't want to sign an ROI, at which point I would have to say, okay, you got to talk to your attorney about this. If someone's not in the right state of mind, how can they sign or not sign an ROI? I think that'd be kind of an interesting vantage point to go at that point, because like if they're so psychotic that they've forgotten who you are, that they've forgotten that maybe you're their beloved mom or dad, then they're probably not going to sign the ROI, right? But they're not in the right state of mind. So there might be some sort of loophole you could explore there with your attorney to see if there's a way to kind of bypass the ROI, or to bypass them having to sign it before you can actually have access to their medical file. For this release of information, what I would recommend doing too is it kind of varies from hospital to hospital, but you'll probably want to Google release of information, behavioral health, and then what you'll see are just a bunch of documents that kind of have a list of things that the person can sign for the information that they want to release. But you want them to release like everything possible you want them to release, because you and your attorney will be able to review those notes. Another important reason you want the ROI is you want the whole treatment team to know there's somebody on the outs who really cares about this person and who's going to be reviewing their documentation. You also want to be able to compare and contrast notes that are written by the various mental health professionals. So there's going to be psychiatrists, psychologists, nurse, mental health aides, CNAs perhaps. There's going to be a large group of people who are going to be providing care for your patient or for your loved one, and you want to know, hey, do their notes make sense? If the psychiatrist is saying, for instance, that little Tommy over here is a danger to others, but then in everyone else's notes, we're not seeing that supported, then what exactly is going on? And just to let you guys know, when I worked in a forensic hospital, I can't tell you how many times a psychiatrist would say that someone is a danger to others, and they wouldn't really have a whole lot of evidence for it. They wouldn't say as evidenced by X, Y, and Z. Or if they did, and you looked at the supporting documentation, meaning the documentation coming from other health professionals working with that client, the documentation would not support the psychiatrist's opinion. So for instance, let's say your loved one is getting e-meds, right? So they would have to one, have a mental diagnosis. We'd want to know what that is. And then we'd want to know how, because of their mental condition, is it leading them to be either gravely disabled, a danger to self, or a danger to others. And then we want to see the documentation that supports that. If the documentation does not support that, then that's something you want to bring up with your attorney and be like, hey, I don't see it here. The psychiatrist is saying that little Tommy is a danger to others, but there's no other supporting documentation. I believe these e-meds were therefore given illegally. Another reason you want ROI is because when you have access to the notes, to the documentation, you want to see if the treatment plan is actually being followed. What are the goals and objectives? What are they doing? What's the treatment team doing on a daily basis to help your patient meet those goals and objectives so he or she can be released from the hospital? Does the treatment plan follow evidence-based medicine? What's the evidence for the treatment? And where does that come from? How do we know that this group or this therapy or this medication is actually going to help our loved one? You'll also want to know how the staff is measuring your patient's progress. How do we know if they're getting better, and how do they measure that progress? Okay, tip number 3, get to know your state regulations and laws regarding mental health. There's going to be a ton of statutes about mental health, about the rights of mental health patients inside of a hospital. There's going to be all these codes of regulations or regulations and codes with, I think it's the code of regulations that you can look up that are kind of offshoots from the laws that you need to know. There's a lot of reading that you need to do. So go on to something like LexisNexis, find your state, and start reading about the laws regarding mental health in your state. You'll also want to familiarize yourself with the Americans with Disabilities Act, because your loved one probably has a mental disability. So you want to make sure that their rights are being respected while they're inside the hospital. Tip number 4 is to get a copy of the hospital or the psychiatric institution's policies and procedures. Know the policies and procedures. It's going to be very long. It's probably going to be like 50 to 100 pages. It's going to be a lot of reading material, but make sure you're very familiar with it, because you want to make sure the hospital is actually following the policies and procedures as it relates to your loved one. Tip number 5 is to get a copy of the code of conduct for staff at the hospital. So staff, when they work inside of the hospital, before they started working on the floor, they had to have signed something called a code of conduct. This really lays out like what is appropriate behavior for all of the mental health professionals while they're working inside of that institution. And you want to make sure that all of them are following that code of conduct when they're interacting with your loved one. And again, one of the only ways you'll know this is if you have a release of information and are able to review the documentation, because other than that, there's probably going to be cameras inside the facility, but you don't have access to those cameras. You don't get to see your loved one on a daily basis. You might not even get to talk to them over the phone. Also, there's one more thing I forgot to add at the beginning of this video that I should have. It just kind of popped in my mind. But like when a patient's inside of a psychiatric facility, they have pretty much almost every right that any other person has. The only thing is that a psychiatrist can restrict almost any right a patient has, which includes a right to a phone, if they believe that somehow that right is interfering with their treatment. Tip number 6 is to get the full names and licenses of everyone who will be interacting with your loved one. It's just good. You want it for your record in case you need to file suit against any of them. You want all of their full legal names. Okay, and then lastly, tip number 7, make sure to call the facility regularly to check in with your loved one. You can probably talk to them on the phone, assuming that their phone rights haven't been restricted. And if they don't want to talk to you on the phone, at least call and see if maybe the hospital can give you an update. If they have signed some sort of ROI, then they can talk about, my little toddler is in the background making noise, so sorry. But if they have signed the ROI, then most likely you'll be able to talk to hospital staff and they can kind of update you on how they're doing, what their day's been like, if they've taken their medication and all that. Plus, you want hospital staff to know that there's someone on the outs who cares about them. I hate to say it, but in my experience, I feel like generally patients are treated a little more fairly and with a little more respect if hospital staff knows that there's someone on the outs who's looking after them. All right, so those are my 7 tips. I want to read them off because I think I kind of forgot them and I feel like this video is just kind of garbled and disjointed. But so my first tip was to lawyer up. My second tip was to get the release of information signed by your loved one. My third tip was to get to know the laws and regulations surrounding mental health in your state. My fourth tip was to get a copy of the hospital policies and procedures. My fifth tip was to get a copy of the code of conduct for all hospital staff. My sixth tip was to get get the full names of the people who provide direct care to your loved one. And my 7th tip was to call your loved one on a regular basis. I hope you found this video helpful. There's probably stuff I'm like forgetting. I did type up this little thing here, but I feel like there's something I'm forgetting. But I do feel like that should give you, and this video should at least give you kind of like a really good basic starting point for how you can help make sure that your loved one is getting the best care possible. Again, if you haven't liked this video, please give it a like or a thumbs up and share with me a comment. Like if you have someone trapped or you've been trapped in a mental health hospital, let me know how maybe some of the stuff in this video might have helped you out. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. All right, cool. Thanks, Tiger. We're all done. We did it.